Hi, my name is Maria Booker and I'm Head of Policy at Fair by Design. So Fair by Design is a campaign that aims to get rid of the poverty premium. So we're interested in the extra costs that people on low incomes pay for essentials like energy.
Answer.
Thank you. I think both Matt and Caroline have set out that the challenge of the energy crisis has not gone away, and even though the worst may be over, prices are still around 40 to 50% higher than prior to the energy crisis and are not expected to come down significantly anytime soon. So we know this is sort of the new normal and people are really struggling. The government's own statistics show that 36.3% of households were spending more than 10% of their after housing cost income on energy, which is a really significant proportion. We have a lived experience advisory panel and we asked them to share some of their experiences with us about what this means in practice, and I wondered if I could just read a couple of those to you just to ground it in real experience. So one of the members of the panel said that she's a single mother and she remembered phoning her energy supplier in tears during the winter, asking them whether there was any help that she could tap into due to her energy prices being so high, because feeding her prepayment electricity meter alone was £10 a day. And she had to pawn some of her jewellery to pay for it, otherwise it would have resulted in having to skip meals in order to save money to pay for it because it was so expensive. Another gentleman explained that he was diabetic, suffering from poor circulation, and his daughter had circulation problems in her hands, and being unable to afford the cost of heating our home, he spent the winter months in pain with black sores on his feet while his daughter's fingers swelled in the cold, and last winter they were unable to use any heating in their home. And if the committee would like to meet with any other members of our lived experience panel, we'd be very happy to arrange that.
Well, thank you very much, and the testimonies I think bring to life the reality of what people face. So very grateful to you for the testimony.
Could I just add that another way of tackling it would be to have a social tariff that's designed to compensate for that standard credit premium. So you could have a warm home discount or a social tariff that gives that money back to people on low incomes who also pay by standard credit.
Maria Booker, anything to add?
We'd strongly agree with that. It's, I think Matt and NEA are the experts in energy efficiency, but it's a really important pillar of making energy affordable.
Great, thanks.
So we're pleased that the government is looking at the eligibility thresholds for older people on lower incomes. As Matt said earlier, unfortunately though, it's not just older people who are struggling with their energy bills, and that's why we are really keen to see a social tariff that would benefit all age groups and not to pit one group against another, but it's important that everybody is covered.
Maria, Caroline.
Our preference is certainly for money to be targeted at those who need it most, so if that's a mechanism for doing so, that's something we'd be keen to explore. We're actually doing some research with a group of charities and energy suppliers at the moment to kind of look at a design of a long-term social tariff, and it's showing that you really need to focus on going beyond benefits and going to people who are on a low income, because we know for warm home discount, even with the expanded scheme this winter, less than half of households in fuel poverty are eligible. So we haven't got the tools at the moment to reach the people who really need it, and that's what we really need to focus on.
Fair by Design told us that it's clear that the warm home discount is no longer adequate to support low income and vulnerable households. So if I could start with your thoughts on that.
So I think the reason that we believe that the warm home discounts are no longer fit for purpose is firstly because of the amount. So it's £150, whereas we know that the warm home the fuel poverty gap is calculated to be about £400. So it's it's several orders of magnitude less than it should be to lift the average household out of fuel poverty. And the second reason is one I mentioned earlier, that it really doesn't reach the amount of fuel poor households that it needs to reach, because it's only based on benefits. So there's two ways I think that you can go from here. You can either build out the warm home discount scheme itself, or you can sort of start with something new, and it doesn't really matter too much what you call it, but the research that AGK and Fair by Design are involved in is actually coming out saying that a lump sum discount with a formula attached to it, or a tier, would be a cost-effective way forward, And if that's what the research comes out with when it's published in July, we would support that. We have traditionally looked at a unit rate discount because we know that there's not a strong link between what consumers consume in terms of energy and their income. So that means that if you are on a low income and you use a lot of energy because you have a disability or a long-term health condition, you automatically, with a unit rate discount, get a built-in kind of increase in support, and vice versa. If you don't need as much energy, you get less support. But there are practical considerations too, and certainly the research we're involved in is pointing in the way of a tiered or formula-based lump sum discount, which isn't too different from a warm home discount scheme, but it does need to go a lot wider than the benefit system. I think that's the real key to make it more effective. Just to say, I think it's important to maintain that link. I mean, that again, a unit cost discount would do that automatically, but if you have a lump sum, there's got to be some both ways. You know, if wholesale prices go up, it must go up as well. But additionally, if the wholesale prices come down, it can also reduce costs for the government too. So there must be a link to wholesale prices there.
Great.
I think I'd just add that I think we need to see going to a social tariff as a journey. There's quite a lot to do, and what we can put in place for this winter isn't likely to be the end product. It may take several iterations to get to what we'd all like to see, which is a much wider benefit going to more people and at a more generous rate. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it now. We should absolutely press ahead with what we can do now. Even if that's going to people on means-tested benefits for the moment, or extending it to people on disability benefits as well. But we mustn't lose sight of the longer term, that we need to have something much more ambitious.
Yeah.
I mean, I totally agree with what my colleagues have said, but I think just to add that I think the real blocker here is the political will around the data sharing. And we're not actually that far off it in terms of it doesn't require too much legislative change or too many changes to regulation, but it does require a culture change and people to be more, particularly around income data, for sort of ministers to really grab the bull by its horns and say, we're going to fix this, because it would not only open up a social tariff, it would also help with winter fuel payments. It would have helped with energy bill support during the pandemic. It will help across many other areas in government. It's not the most glamorous subject, but it will open up so many options if that is really grasped.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, Polly Billington, please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to hear your support for a mandatory social energy tariff, as something that I've been campaigning for. So I'm interested particularly on this issue of data sharing, because that quite often ends up being the reason why people sort of say to me, yes, we agree it's a good idea, but sorry, we can't do it, which I won't have any truck with. I've had the energy companies telling me that for years. So can you give me reasons that I can go back to them and say, stop being a block to this?
Well, as I say, it's sort of really around the culture. It's easier to kind of withhold the data than it is to share it, because you're much more likely to get into trouble. Policy Practice have done some really good work in this area, and they talk about the conflict with GDPR and sharing once rather than using the data for a number of purposes once it's been given permission to be shared. It just requires a few tweaks to those regulations, so it's a little bit more able to use data for a number of purposes, and that would really help reduce the burden of doing this. I mean, Policy and Practice has said that many of these technical solutions are actually quite simple. They could be done in a few weeks. It's about the kind of bureaucracy that's put around it and the unwillingness to kind of share that's the problem. Just to agree that we would absolutely support it too. So energy debt now stands at 3.8 billion, and that's a rise of 2 billion in the last 3 years. So we definitely think something's needed. We'd agree that it should be as automatic as possible and also as ambitious as possible. The impact assessment that was published with the consultation actually showed that the scheme wouldn't get that near the amount of debt and arrears that built up in the energy crisis, and we think that's a shame. It should be as ambitious as it can. I should just note that although we're really pleased that the scheme is being looked at, if it isn't brought in at the same time as efforts to improve energy affordability, that debt is just going to build up again. So it's really important that the two things are looked at together. I would agree with Matt. I think you need to look at this from lots of different angles, and certainly the reforms to the energy market more widely that will support more renewable generation, should bring down the costs of wholesale electricity over time, which is really helpful. But we also need to look at affordability measures and energy efficiency as well.
With particular points?
So I defer to NEA's greater expertise on this, but I would just say that I'm a learning partner for a project called Taking Action on Rural Poverty, which is working with 2 groups in Argyll and Butte in Aberdeenshire to empower people who are affected by rural poverty to tackle it themselves and to look at what they would like to see as a proper solution. And certainly off-gas, off-grid customers is a high priority in those groups. So I think we would like to see funding that is mainly not or just on bill payers, because that's a more progressive way of paying for it. We did a report with the Fabians last year, which I'm very happy to share with the committee, but it looked at a funded way of funding a 20% social tariff, and it had a number of options in that report for doing that, including scrapping capital allowances for new oil and gas developments in the first year, maintaining customer contributions under the warm home discount, diverting the amount raised by the 2023 supplier profit margin increase, using the bad debt allowance to fund lower prices, and reforming capital allowances for suppliers and distributors. And that would ensure that you could get a 20% social tariff without any extra money going on bills. But I'm happy to send that to you. But that's one idea. I think it's worth looking at a range of them. Percentage on it, so that we haven't actually calculated that per se. I think 10% is been a definition of fuel poverty for many years. It's a significant percentage of after tax income, and we think, as you say, 9 million households spending that amount is too high. And I think the main goal must be to tackle fuel poverty, and that is the definition of fuel poverty we believe is the right one, and we'd like to see that come down as much as possible.
Something below 10% as far as possible. Is the broad answer. Anybody else?
Well, I would agree. We've also called for the getting rid of VAT in the past, so we would agree with that one. But would also support the point that it's about where that funding goes on government levies. So that some of the schemes that it supports are really, really important. We'd like to keep those schemes. So where the alternative funding. But if I can suggest some others to you,
well, as long as they're simple. I mean, my concern is that we're getting this more complicated. And the government has announced that it was going to reduce household fuel bills by £300. It's well short of doing that. The suggestion I put forward would reduce the average bill by £269, and it could be done with a stroke of the pen by the government now. And it wouldn't add to the burden of bureaucracy associated with means testing, etc., etc. And indeed, you could argue that the £269 reduction in all bills would be a means of an alternative way of dealing with the issue of the winter fuel payments. But trying to make government more simple, we in politics try to do that, but it's always the Treasury that seems to be pushing in the opposite direction. And the discussions we've had today around having some social tariffs and all the rest of it, and extra subsidies here and subsidies there, and that's just further complicating what should be a simple issue.
And I take your point. I mean, I think the other one that might be worth looking at is standing charges. There's certainly elements of those that could be funded under general taxation, which would reduce bills for people, and they affect people on low income, so they're hardest hit by those.
Just to follow up on Chris Chope's question, would you advocate using taxation to replace the levies, and how would you? And the other thing is, how would you fund the cut in VAT?
I think the government has to look at some ways. If you're looking at reducing energy bills, one way is just shifting some of those costs to general taxation. And I know that's not an easy thing for the government to contemplate at the moment, but that could be done in a number of ways. And some of the ones you suggest, are worth looking at, particularly the VAT. And I'd say standing charges are another one to look at as well. But yeah, it's about shifting how much should be borne by taxpayers and how much should be borne by bill payers, and perhaps the balance isn't quite right at the moment.
Yeah, just
to mention that the research that I mentioned earlier that's being done by a group of charities, including AG2K and Fair by Design, is modelling a number of options, including a rising block tariff, and the early indications sort of suggest that it generates significant bill increases for people who are just losing out on it. So it doesn't look like the most optimal solution compared to others that they've modelled.
Thank you all very much.